The sun was a brutal, white coin in a washed-out sky, baking the dust of forward operating base saber into a fine powder that coated everything. Lena Kovac stepped out of the armored transport, the heat hitting her like a physical wall. She blinked, adjusting her eyes to the glare, her small suitcase feeling absurd in her hand. She hadn't come here as a soldier, but as a wife. For 72 hours, this stark, sand-colored outpost at the edge of the known world was supposed to be a strange kind of holiday. Her husband, Sergeant Marko Kovac, was already striding towards her, his grin cutting through the serious lines of his face. He swept her into a hug that smelled of sun-warmed canvas, gun oil, and home. For a moment, the barbed wire, the watchtowers, the distant, hazy mountains that hid a persistent enemy, all of it faded. He showed her around with a mix of pride and apology, the chow hall, the makeshift gym, the tiny room with a real cot that was theirs for 3 days. He introduced her to his squad, Babyface O'Reilly, who blushed when she shook his hand, Doc Hendricks, who gave her a firm nod, and Corporal Chun, who offered her a precious, warm soda. They were boys playing at being men, and men hardened by a reality she only knew from Marco's heavily edited letters. That first evening, they sat on ammo crates behind the command post, watching the sunset bleed into the mountains. Marco pointed to a distant ridge. See that shadow line? That's no man's listen. Quiet for weeks now. His voice was casual, but his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. Lena, a graphic designer from a leafy suburb, felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cooling air. The weight of the place, the silent tension, was a living thing. Later, in the hushed dark of their room, Marco held her hand under the scratchy blanket. "I'm so glad you're here," he whispered, his voice rough. "Just, if the sirens go, you go to the bunker. No arguments. You're a visitor here," she promised, pushing down a flutter of fear. She was here to be his peace, not another worry. The second day began with a normalcy that felt forced. Lena helped in the mess, peeling potatoes with a private who missed his mother's cooking. She took pictures of the absurd, a scorpion in a plastic cup, the guys playing cards, to make the reality less sharp. Marco had a half day of duty, and, in the afternoon, he took her to the firing range. "Everyone on base qualifies," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. It was a rule, a safety protocol. He handed her his personal rifle, a well-managed M4 carbine. Lena, who had only ever shot a .22 at a county fair years ago, felt clumsy. Marco stood behind her, his hands guiding hers, his voice calm in her ear. Steady pressure on the trigger. Don't fight the recoil. She fired, the kick surprising her, the paper target downrange showing a cluster in the outer rings. Not bad for a rookie, he smiled. Then, almost as an afterthought, he pointed to a different weapon on a rack, longer, heavier, with a powerful scope. That's Chin's baby, the M110 sniper system. Different beast entirely. He let her look through the scope. The world leaped forward in stunning, terrifying clarity. She could see the stitching on a sandbag 200 meters away, the grain of the wood on a distant post. The intimacy of the magnification felt intrusive. She pulled back, unsettled. "It's like playing God," she murmured. Marco's smile faded. "No, it's about patience and wind and math. It's the opposite of impulse." That night, the base held a rare barbecue. There was laughter, terrible singing, a sense of fragile community. Lena felt herself relaxing, starting to see the rhythm of Marco's life here. As they walked back to their quarters under a blanket of stars so thick it felt suffocating, the first rocket screamed in. The explosion was not a sound, but a compression of the world, followed by a deafening roar that threw them to the ground. Dirt rained down. The sirens wailed, a ghostly, electronic shriek. "Lena, bunker. Now," Marco yelled, shoving her towards a reinforced concrete structure before sprinting towards the chaos erupting at the western perimeter. The base, so orderly moments before, dissolved into a storm of shouting men, tracer fire arcing into the dark, and the crump of mortars. Lena stumbled, disoriented, towards the bunker. Then she saw it. The direct hit on the comms tower, a fireball blooming against the night. And, tumbling from the wreckage, a broken, bleeding figure, Corporal Chun. The world narrowed to a tunnel of smoke and noise. Lena didn't think. She ran, not towards the bunker, but towards Chun. She dragged him by his vest, gritting teeth against his dead weight, away from the burning debris. They collapsed behind a low concrete blast wall. Chin's leg was a ruin, but his eyes were fierce. "My rifle," he choked, blood at his lips. "Sniper, on the southern ridge, pinning down the mortar team. Can't get a shot." He pointed a trembling hand. Not 20 feet away, lying where it had fallen from the comms tower wreckage, was the long, dark shape of the M110, its scope glinting in the firelight. The order, Marco's order, echoed in her head. Go to the bunker. But Marco was out there on the western wall, and the enemy had a sniper locking down the very team that could silence the mortars hammering his position. A cold, clear certainty washed over her. She scrambled on hands and knees, the heat of the nearby fire searing her skin. She grabbed the rifle, heavier than she remembered, and crawled back to Chun. "Tell me," she said, her voice a stranger's. Chun, fading, became a teacher. "Safety off, look through the scope, find the ridge, look for the muzzle flash, breathe out. Hold, squeeze." His words were interspersed with pained gasps. Lena settled behind the weapon, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the stock. The scope's world was a hellscape of smoke and shadow. She panned across the southern ridge, a dark silhouette against the lesser dark of the sky. Then, she saw it, a tiny, periodic wink of orange light. The sniper, confident, undisputed, firing at his leisure. She remembered Marco's words. Patience, wind, math. She had none of those. She had only the crosshairs, a trembling body, and the image of her husband caught in a mortar barrage. She took a ragged breath, let it half out, and, as another muzzle flash bloomed in the scope, she placed the crosshairs just above it, praying the distance Chun had gasped was right. Her finger tightened. The rifle roared, the recoil slamming into her shoulder with brutal force. She lost the sight picture in the violent jump. When she wrestled the scope back, the muzzle flash on the ridge was gone. A strange, localized silence seemed to fall on the southern approach. A moment later, she heard a new sound, the steady thump-thump-thump of their own mortar team, now unhindered, finding its rhythm. She had done it. A wave of nausea hit her. She dropped the rifle and turned back to Chun, applying pressure to his leg with hands slick with his blood, her mind screaming, her body shaking. The aftermath was a blur of noise and light that gradually resolved into a grim, exhausted stillness. The attack had been repelled, the enemy melting back into the mountains with the coming dawn. Lena sat wrapped in a foil blanket in the medical tent, Chin stabilized and evacuated, her ears ringing in the sudden quiet. The base commander, a haggard colonel with soot on his face, stood before her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gravelly, "Corporal Chun is alive because of you. And my mortar team took out 3 enemy tubes after that southern sniper went silent. You changed the fight." His words felt distant, meant for someone else. Then, Marco was there, his uniform torn, his face streaked with grime and sweat. He didn't speak. He just knelt in front of her, took her filthy, shaking hands in his, and looked at her, really looked. The fear, the pride, the awe, the love, it was all there, too vast for words. He pulled her into a tight embrace, and she finally broke, silent sobs shaking her frame against his solid chest. There were no medals, no official citations for a civilian. But, as she was prepped for evacuation on the next medevac bird out, the men of Sabre lined up. Not a formal formation, but a silent, ragged line along the dust-choked path to the landing zone. As she walked past with Marco, each soldier, from the greenest private to the hardened colonel, offered a nod, a quiet "ma'am," a solemn salute. It was a recognition more profound than any ceremony. On the helicopter, the thunder of the rotors drowned all thought. Marco held her hand tightly, staring out at the receding base, now just a scar on the desert. Lena looked down at her hands, clean now, but feeling forever stained. She had crossed a line she never knew existed, drawn by love into a realm of violence and impossible choice. She had not played God. She had simply, in one breath-held moment, chosen one man's life, her man's life, over another's. The woman who had arrived 3 days earlier was gone, left behind in the dust and the smoke. The woman flying home carried a new, heavy weight, a silent understanding of the precise cost of the peace she was returning to, and the unbreakable, complicated bond forged not just in love, but in fire.